Admiral Henry Brooks sat in his office on Earth and stared at the quantum communication screen. Captain Morrison's message had arrived 3 days ago, and since then Brooks had not been able to sleep properly. The images from the Veltar ruins showed creatures that looked exactly like humans, but the way the aliens had drawn them made his blood run cold. Dr. Karen Walsh entered his office carrying a thick folder of research papers. She was Earth's best xenobiologist and had been studying the Veltar data around the clock since it arrived. Her face looked pale and worried. "Admiral, I've analyzed everything Captain Morrison sent us," she said, sitting down across from his desk. "The implications are more disturbing than we first thought. The Veltar weren't just any alien race. They were incredibly advanced, possibly the most sophisticated civilization we've ever discovered evidence of." Brooks opened the folder and looked at the translated Veltar texts. The writing was beautiful, but the words were terrifying. The aliens described the Devourers as beings who consumed not through eating, but through friendship and alliance. They wrote about watching their enemies become friends with these creatures, then abandoning their old ways to follow them. "What does this mean exactly?" Brooks asked. "How does someone conquer through friendship?" Dr. Walsh pulled out more documents. "That's what makes this so frightening, Admiral. The Veltar described the Devourers as beings who never came as conquerors. They always arrived offering help, bringing gifts and asking to be friends. But somehow everyone who accepted their friendship ended up changing completely." Colonel Rick Hayes knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. He looked like he had been running, and his uniform was slightly messy. In his hand, he carried a tablet with new information. "Admiral, we just received another transmission from Captain Morrison," Hayes said breathlessly. "Dr. Bennett's team has made a breakthrough in the translation work. The Veltar left detailed records about their encounters with the Devourers, and the pattern is always the same." Hayes activated his tablet and showed them new pictures. These carvings were different from the others. Instead of showing humans as monsters, they showed humans talking with Veltar individuals. The aliens in these carvings looked happy and relaxed, like they were having pleasant conversations with their human visitors. According to the new translations, the Devourers would arrive at Veltar worlds and ask for permission to study their culture, Hayes explained. They claimed to be explorers and scientists who wanted to learn about different ways of life. The Veltar, being naturally curious and peaceful, always welcomed them. Dr. Walsh leaned forward to study the images more closely. "But then what happened? Why did the Veltar become so afraid of them?" Hayes scrolled to the next set of pictures. These showed something that made all 3 humans in the room feel uncomfortable. The carvings depicted Veltar individuals who looked different from the others. They stood apart from their groups, their body language suggesting independence and individual thought. The Veltar described this as the infection, Hayes said quietly. After spending time with the Devourers, some Veltar began to think differently. They started making decisions on their own, instead of following the group. They began to question their leaders and express personal opinions. Brooks felt his heart beating faster. "And the Veltar saw this as a bad thing?" "Apparently, yes," Dr. Walsh said, reading from her notes. "The Veltar were a collective species. They made all decisions as a group and shared all thoughts with each other. Individual thinking was completely foreign to them. When their people started acting independently after meeting humans, it was like watching their civilization fall apart." Hayes showed them more carvings. These depicted Veltar individuals who had been infected by human contact, teaching other Veltar to think for themselves. The images showed the idea spreading from person to person like a disease, until entire Veltar communities were thinking and acting as individuals instead of as a collective. "The most disturbing part," Hayes continued, "is what the Veltar write about human intentions. They never describe the Devourers as evil or cruel. In fact, they repeatedly mention that these creatures seemed genuinely kind and helpful. The humans apparently shared their technology freely, offered medical aid to sick Veltar, and even helped them solve problems between different Veltar groups." Dr. Walsh pulled out another document. "I've been analyzing the psychological profiles the Veltar created of the Devourers. They described them as beings with an unstoppable drive to help others, even when that help wasn't wanted. The Veltar write about watching humans see suffering and become obsessed with fixing it, regardless of whether their interference was welcome. Brooks stood up and walked to his window. Outside, he could see Earth's blue oceans and green continents. Somewhere out there in space, an ancient alien race had encountered creatures that looked exactly like the humans walking around down there, and those aliens had been so terrified by human kindness that they had fled across the galaxy. "There's more, Admiral," Hayes said. Dr. Bennett found references to something the Veltar called the Great Scattering. It appears that when the Devourers arrived in Veltar space, they didn't just affect one or two worlds. The influence spread across the entire Veltar empire. Billions of aliens began thinking independently, questioning authority, and making personal choices. Dr. Walsh nodded grimly. From the Veltar perspective, this was the end of their civilization. Everything they had built was based on collective thinking and group harmony. When their people started acting as individuals, their entire way of life collapsed. Brooks turned back to face them. So the Veltar didn't flee from human cruelty. They fled from human kindness that destroyed their society. "That's correct, Admiral," Hayes said. And according to the final Veltar records, the Devourers never understood why the Veltar were afraid of them. The humans genuinely believed. They were helping by teaching the aliens about individual freedom and personal choice. They couldn't comprehend that their gifts were seen as weapons. Dr. Walsh closed her folder and looked at both men seriously. "Admiral, if these records are accurate, then humanity's greatest threat to other species isn't our technology or our military. It's our fundamental belief that everyone deserves freedom and individual choice. To species that value collective harmony above all else, we are not liberators. We are destroyers of entire ways of life." Brooks sat back down and stared at the Veltar images on his screen. The ancient aliens had carved humanity's name into their fears, not because humans were evil, but because human compassion was unstoppable and transformative. They had run from creatures who couldn't see suffering without trying to fix it, who couldn't encounter different ways of life without wanting to share the gift of individual freedom. The most terrifying part was that the humans, in the Veltar records, had never meant any harm. They had simply been trying to help. Dr. Paul Miller stood in front of the massive Veltar device and tried to understand how it worked. The machine was built from materials that didn't exist anywhere else in the known universe, and it hummed with energy that his instruments couldn't measure. Captain Morrison had found it in the deepest part of the Veltar ruins, hidden behind walls that had taken his team 3 days to break through. "Have you figured out what it does yet?" Captain Susan Wright asked as she walked into the chamber. She had arrived 2 weeks ago with reinforcements from Earth, bringing more scientists and equipment to study the Veltar ruins. Dr. Miller shook his head and pointed at his computer screens. "It's some kind of viewing device, but not for looking at places. It seems designed to look at time itself. The Veltar writings call it a timeline observer, but I'm not sure how that's possible." Dr. Tony Rodriguez walked over from where he had been studying Veltar symbols carved into the chamber walls. He was Earth's best expert on ancient languages, and he had been working day and night to understand the instructions left behind by the aliens. "According to these writings," Tony said, "the Veltar could see across different streams of time. They didn't just predict the future. They could actually observe what was happening in parallel realities where time moved differently." Captain Wright frowned and looked at the strange device. "You mean they could see alternate versions of history?" "That's exactly what I mean," Tony replied. "The Veltar weren't fortune-tellers. They were observers of multiple timelines. When they wrote about the Devourers, they weren't making predictions. They were recording things they had actually witnessed happening in other realities." Dr. Miller felt his hands shaking as he realized what this meant. If that's true, then somewhere in the multiverse humans really did encounter the Veltar, and whatever happened in those meetings was so terrible that the Veltar in our timeline decided to flee before it could happen here too. Meanwhile, on the research station Omega-7, Dr. Lisa Bennett was making discoveries that made her question everything she thought she knew about human nature. She had been analyzing Veltar records from 17 different worlds, and the BTU pattern was always the same. Her assistant, Dr. Amy Carter, walked into the lab carrying another box of Veltar artifacts. Amy looked exhausted from weeks of translation work, but her eyes were bright with excitement. "Lisa, you need to see what I found in the latest batch of records," Amy said, setting the box down on the table. The Veltar didn't just encounter humans once. They met them dozens of times across different timelines, and every single meeting followed the same pattern. Lisa looked at the translated documents Amy handed her. The records described humans arriving at Veltar worlds in ships that looked nothing like current human designs. These humans were more advanced than present-day humanity, but their behavior was exactly what Lisa expected from her own species. "Look at this entry," Amy said, pointing to a specific passage. "The Veltar write about humans who arrived offering to help solve a conflict between two Veltar city-states. The humans studied both sides, learned their languages, and then spent months working to arrange peace talks." Lisa read the passage and felt her stomach clench. "Did it work? Did the humans help them make peace?" Amy nodded grimly. "That's the problem. It worked perfectly. The humans convinced both city-states to stop fighting and work together. But in the process, they taught the Veltar about concepts like compromise, negotiation, and individual decision-making. Within a year, the entire Veltar social structure on that world had changed completely." Lisa continued reading and found more examples. In every case, humans had arrived with good intentions and genuine desire to help. They had ended wars, cured diseases, shared technology, and solved problems that had plagued Veltar society for generations. But their help always came with unintended consequences. The humans couldn't help without teaching the Veltar about human values like personal freedom, individual choice, and the right to disagree. These concepts spread through Veltar communities like a virus, destroying the collective harmony that their entire civilization was based on. Back in the ruins, Dr. Miller had managed to activate part of the Veltar timeline device. The machine projected images into the air that showed events from parallel realities. Miller watched in fascination as the device showed him actual footage of humans meeting with Veltar in alternate timelines. The humans in these visions looked slightly different from present-day people, but their behavior was unmistakably human. They smiled easily, offered gifts freely, and seemed genuinely interested in learning about Veltar culture. Miller watched human diplomats shaking hands with Veltar leaders, human doctors treating sick aliens, and human engineers helping to repair broken Veltar technology. "They look so normal," Captain Wright said, watching the projections. "These don't look like the monsters the Veltar described in their carvings." Dr. Rodriguez adjusted the machine's controls and showed them different scenes. "That's because they weren't monsters in the traditional sense. Watch this." The new images showed what happened after the humans had been living among the Veltar for several months. Individual Veltar began questioning decisions made by their collective leadership. They started forming personal friendships instead of group bonds. Some even began leaving their birth communities to join mixed groups of humans and other Veltar who had been infected with individual thinking. "The humans never forced anyone to change," Rodriguez explained. "They just lived according to their own values and couldn't help but influence everyone around them. When Veltar saw humans making personal choices and thinking independently, some of them wanted to try it too." Miller watched more scenes from the timeline device and saw the pattern, repeating over and over. Humans would arrive peacefully, make friends with local Veltar, and gradually introduce human concepts without even realizing they were doing it. The Veltar who spent time with humans began to change, and then they influenced other Veltar, spreading individual thinking throughout their society. In every timeline, the process was the same. The humans had good intentions, and the Veltar who changed seemed happier as individuals. But from the perspective of Veltar leadership, watching their collective society transform into groups of independent thinkers was horrifying. "Look at this final scene," Rodriguez said, adjusting the controls one more time. The device showed a Veltar leader standing before a great assembly. The translation appeared as text below the image, and Miller read it aloud. "The Devourers have not conquered us through war. They have destroyed us through friendship. Our people no longer think as one. They make choices as individuals and follow their own desires instead of the collective good. We must flee before the infection spreads further. We must find a place where the devourers cannot follow, or our civilization will cease to exist. Miller turned off the device and stood in silence with his companions. They had just witnessed the truth about why the Veltar feared humanity. It wasn't because humans were evil or violent. It was because human nature was so fundamentally different from Veltar nature that peaceful contact between the species inevitably destroyed Veltar civilization. The aliens had carved humanity's name into their fears because humans couldn't coexist with collective species without changing them. Human friendship was a weapon more powerful than any gun because it taught other beings to value individual freedom over group harmony. And once that lesson was learned, there was no going back. Captain Jake Morrison felt sick as he stood on the bridge of the New Horizon and looked at what remained of the Veltar home galaxy. Through the timeline viewing device, his crew had found the coordinates to the original Veltar homeworld, and what they discovered there made his hands shake. The galaxy was still inhabited, but it no longer belonged to the Veltar. Every world they scanned showed the same thing: mixed populations of dozens of different species living together in harmony. Former enemies worked side by side, shared technology freely, and seemed genuinely happy. But there wasn't a single pure Veltar collective left anywhere. Dr. Lisa Bennett walked up to him with her latest report. Her face was pale and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Captain, we've identified what happened here. The humans in this timeline didn't conquer the Veltar through war. They turned them into something else entirely." Jake looked at the data on her tablet. The scan showed cities where Veltar lived alongside species that had once been their bitter enemies. Former war zones had become centers of trade and cultural exchange. Weapons factories had been converted into schools and research facilities. "How many species are down there?" Jake asked. 47 different intelligent races, all living on worlds that used to belong exclusively to the Veltar," Lisa replied. According to the timeline device records, this transformation took place over about 50 years. The humans didn't force anyone to change. They just started helping different species talk to each other instead of fighting. Colonel Rick Hayes joined them on the bridge, carrying new intelligence reports from Earth Command. He had been studying military data about the transformed galaxy, trying to understand how humans had managed to change an entire region of space without firing a single shot. "Captain, Admiral Brooks wants you to see this," Hayes said, activating the main screen. "We've been monitoring communications from the surface of the former Veltar homeworld. The beings down there are still talking about the Devourers, but not the way we expected." The screen showed intercepted transmissions between various alien species. Jake listened as the universal translator converted their words into English. Instead of fear and hatred, the aliens were discussing the Devourers with something that sounded like gratitude mixed with concern. They described the humans as beings who cannot see conflict without trying to resolve it, Hayes explained. According to these transmissions, the Devourers have a psychological condition that makes them incapable of ignoring suffering or injustice. When they see two species fighting, they become obsessed with making them friends. Dr. Karen Walsh's voice came through the communication system from Earth. She had been analyzing the data they were sending back, and her conclusions were disturbing. "Captain Morrison, what you're seeing is the result of humans doing exactly what humans do naturally. We see problems and we try to fix them. We see enemies and we try to make them friends. We see suffering and we can't rest until we've helped." Jake walked to the observation deck and looked down at the planet below. Cities sparkled with lights from dozens of different species, all living together peacefully. It should have been beautiful, but knowing how it came to be made it terrifying. Dr. Tony Rodriguez joined him at the window, carrying translation data from the planet's surface. "Captain, I've been listening to their historical records. The humans who transformed this galaxy weren't trying to destroy Veltar civilization. They were trying to help them solve a refugee crisis." Jake turned to look at him. "What kind of refugee crisis?" "The Veltar were at war with 17 different species," Rodriguez explained. "Millions of beings from all sides were dying from starvation and disease. When the humans arrived and saw the suffering, They couldn't just ignore it. They started by offering medical aid to refugees from all species, not taking sides in the HFY War. Rodriguez pulled up holographic displays showing the historical progression. The humans built refugee camps where injured beings from different species were treated together. For the first time, enemies were seeing each other as fellow sufferers instead of targets. The humans encouraged them to talk to each other, to share their stories. Jake watched the data and saw the pattern emerging. The humans had set up medical stations, food distribution centers, and schools for refugee children from all species. But they had done something more dangerous. They had treated everyone equally regardless of which side they were on in the war. Within 6 months, some refugees didn't want to go back to fighting, Rodriguez continued. They had made friends with former enemies in the human camps. They started asking the humans to help them negotiate peace treaties instead of just treating their wounds. Dr. Lisa Bennett accessed more records from the timeline device. The humans were happy to help with negotiations, but they brought their own values to the process. They insisted that every individual had the right to choose which side they wanted, to support or whether they wanted to fight at all. They introduced concepts like conscientious objection and asylum for those who wanted to leave the war entirely. Jake felt his heart pounding as he realized what this meant. The humans had destroyed the Veltar collective not through violence, but by giving individual Veltar the right to make personal choices about their own lives. Captain Susan writes, voice came through the communication system from her ship. She had been exploring other parts of the galaxy, and her reports were equally disturbing. Captain Morrison, I'm finding the same pattern on every world I visit. The humans didn't conquer anyone. They just couldn't stand seeing beings suffer. So they offered alternatives to warfare and collective thinking. Dr. Paul Miller activated the timeline device again and showed them scenes from the final days of pure Veltar civilization. The images showed Veltar leaders meeting with human diplomats, but the conversations weren't about surrender or conquest. The humans offered to leave if the Veltar wanted them to, Miller said as they watched the historical footage. But by that point, millions of individual Veltar had chosen to stay in the mixed communities. They preferred their new lives as individuals to their old lives as part of the collective. The final scene showed a Veltar leader speaking to his people one last time. The translation made Jake's blood run cold. The Devourers have not taken anything from us by force. They have given our people choices we never knew existed. Now our children choose their own paths instead of following the collective will. They marry who they love instead of who the group selects. They think thoughts that belong to them alone. This is not the Veltar way, but it is the way our people have chosen. We who still believe in the collective must leave or watch our civilization, and not in war, but in the happiness of our own children. Dr. Walsh's voice came through the speakers again from Earth. Captain, what we're seeing is proof that the Veltar were right to be afraid of us. Not because we're evil, but because our very nature is toxic to collective species. We can't help but teach other beings that they have the right to choose their own destinies. Jake stared at the mixed cities on the planet below, and understood why the Veltar had fled across time and space. They hadn't run from human cruelty or human conquest. They had run from human kindness that gave their people freedom to leave the collective and choose individual happiness instead. The aliens had carved humanity's name into their fears because humans were not conquerors or destroyers. They were liberators who couldn't be stopped. And liberation was the most terrifying thing imaginable to a species that valued collective harmony above individual choice. The humans in the timeline had never meant to destroy Veltar civilization. They had simply offered Veltar individuals the choice to be something other than part of a collective, and enough Veltar had chosen freedom to transform their entire society forever. Admiral Henry Brooks sat in the emergency session of the United Earth Council and watched the faces of world leaders as they absorbed the shocking truth about humanity's place in the universe. The evidence was undeniable now. Across multiple timelines, humans had encountered the Veltar with good intentions and had accidentally destroyed their civilization through kindness. Dr. Paul Miller stood at the front of the room, presenting the final data from the timeline viewing device. The massive screen showed images of humans and aliens living together peacefully in the transformed Veltar galaxy. but everyone in the room understood the terrible cost of that peace. The pattern is consistent across every timeline we've observed, Dr. Miller explained to the assembled leaders. Humans make contact with the Veltar offering friendship and aid. Within decades, Veltar collective society transforms into something completely different. Not through conquest, but through the simple act of giving individuals the choice to think for themselves. President Maria Santos of the North American Federation raised her hand. Dr. Miller, are you saying that human contact with certain alien species is inevitably destructive even when we have peaceful intentions? Dr. Miller nodded grimly. That appears to be the case with collective species like the Veltar. Our fundamental belief in individual rights and personal freedom is so alien to them that even casual contact spreads these ideas through their society like a virus. To us, we're offering liberation. To them, we're destroying everything they value. Dr. Karen Walsh stepped forward with new intelligence that made the situation even more urgent. Council members, we have a more immediate problem. 3 days ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected artificial signals from the edge of human space. The signals are using Veltar communication protocols, and they're not ancient recordings. Brooks felt his stomach clench as he realized what this meant. The Veltar are still alive, and they're watching us. Dr. Lisa Bennett activated another screen that showed the intercepted Veltar transmissions. Her translation work had revealed the content of the messages, and they were exactly what everyone feared. The current Veltar are calling our timeline the final timeline, Lisa explained. They've been fleeing across parallel realities for millions of years, always staying one step ahead of human expansion. But according to these messages, they believe they've reached the last timeline where humans haven't evolved yet. Captain, Jake Morrison spoke from his position via quantum communication from the New Horizon. Admiral, the Veltar messages describe human expansion patterns they've observed across dozens of timelines. They're predicting that within 50 years, humans will make contact with their current hiding places. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Somewhere in space, ancient aliens were watching humanity's growth and preparing for another exodus to escape human friendship. Secretary General Chen Li of the Pacific Alliance asked the question everyone was thinking. What are our options? Can we choose to avoid contact with the Veltar to prevent this cycle from repeating? Dr. Tony Rodriguez brought up historical data on human exploration patterns. Secretary General, that would require us to fundamentally change human nature. Every timeline the Veltar observed shows the same thing. Humans who encounter suffering cannot ignore it. Humans who see conflict must try to resolve it. Humans who meet other species inevitably offer friendship and assistance. Colonel Rick Hayes presented military analysis that painted an even bleaker picture. Council members, the Veltar describe observing human behavior across multiple realities. In every case, when humans encountered species in conflict or suffering, they couldn't help but intervene. Even when human governments ordered non-interference, individual humans would violate those orders to help others. President Santos leaned forward in her chair. Are you saying that avoiding contact with the Veltar is impossible because humans are psychologically incapable of ignoring other beings in distress? That's exactly what I'm saying, Hayes replied. The Veltar call it the human curse. They describe it as a species-wide mental condition that makes humans unable to see injustice without trying to correct it, unable to see enemies without trying to make them friends, and unable to see different ways of life without wanting to share what they consider to be the gift of individual freedom. Dr. Walsh presented the most disturbing data yet. Council members, the Veltar have been studying human psychology across timelines for millions of years. Their analysis concludes that humans don't spread individual thinking intentionally. We do it simply by being ourselves. When other beings see humans making personal choices, expressing individual opinions and forming friendships based on personal preference rather than group assignment, some of them want to try it too. The screen showed Veltar psychological profiles of humans from multiple timelines. The aliens described humans as beings who couldn't coexist with collective species without accidentally teaching them about personal freedom. Even humans who tried to respect Veltar collective culture would inevitably demonstrate individual thinking just by living their normal lives. Admiral Brooks stood up and addressed the council. We're facing an unprecedented situation. An ancient, alien species has identified humanity as an existential threat to their way of life. Not because we're violent or aggressive, but because our values are contagious. Simply by being ourselves, we destroy collective civilizations by offering their individuals the choice to be something different. The latest Veltar transmission appeared on screen, translated by Dr. Bennett. The message was directed at the Veltar fleet preparing for another escape, but its content chilled everyone in the room. The Devourers are expanding into space as predicted. They build ships and explore new worlds, always seeking to learn about other forms of life. They will find us within decades, and when they do, they will offer friendship and aid. Our young will be fascinated by their individual thinking and personal choices. The infection will spread again, and we will lose another generation to the promise of freedom. Prepare the fleet. We must find a reality where the Devourers never evolved, or accept that our civilization ends here. President Santos asked the final question that everyone dreaded. What do we do with this knowledge? Do we try to change human nature to avoid destroying the Veltar, or do we accept that some species cannot coexist with humanity? Dr. Miller brought up the timeline data one more time. Council members, I've analyzed every recorded encounter between humans and Veltar across multiple realities. In timelines where humans tried to suppress their nature and avoid spreading individual thinking, they failed. Human nature is too fundamental to suppress. But in timelines where humans accepted what they were, the transformed societies that resulted were happier and more prosperous than the original collective cultures. Admiral Brooks delivered the final conclusion to the council. We have a choice to make as a species. We can try to isolate ourselves and suppress our nature to protect collective species like the Veltar, or we can accept that humanity's gift to the universe is the concept that every individual deserves the right to choose their own destiny, even if that gift destroys civilizations that don't value individual freedom. The vote was unanimous. Earth would continue its expansion into space, knowing that human contact with collective species would inevitably transform them. The council chose to believe that offering beings the choice to think for themselves was worth the cost of destroying civilizations built on collective harmony. As the meeting ended, Admiral Brooks looked at the star charts showing human expansion. Wrote, somewhere out there the Veltar were preparing to flee once again from creatures whose only crime was believing that every being in the universe deserved the right to make personal choices about their own life. The aliens had carved humanity's name into their fears because humans were not destroyers or conquerors. They were liberators whose gift of individual freedom was so powerful that it transformed entire civilizations, and that transformation could never be undone. Human compassion, backed by human determination to help others, was indeed the most unstoppable force in the universe. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the New Horizon and watched the dead planet grow larger on the main screen. The world looked brown and empty, with no sign of water or life anywhere on its surface. His science team had been studying this place for 3 weeks now, and what they found down there made his stomach feel sick. Dr. Lisa Bennett walked up to him with her tablet in her hands. She looked tired and worried, like she had not slept well for many days. Her hair was messy, and her clothes were wrinkled from spending too much time in the research lab. "Captain, you need to see what we found today," she said in a quiet voice. "It changes everything we thought we knew." Jake looked at the tablet screen and saw pictures of huge stone buildings. The structures were massive, bigger than anything humans had ever built. They stretched across the planet's surface like a great city that went on forever. But the city was empty now, with no signs of the people who had built it. "These buildings are millions of years old," Lisa said. "Whatever race built them was far more advanced than us. Their technology was beyond anything we can understand. But that's not the strange part." She touched the screen and showed him new pictures. Jake felt his breath catch in his throat when he saw what was carved into the stone walls. The images showed creatures that looked exactly like humans. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head on top, and those forward-facing eyes that marked humans as predators. But in every carving, these human-like figures were shown as monsters. The stone pictures showed humans destroying cities, humans chasing fleeing aliens, humans standing over defeated enemies. In some carvings, the humans had their arms raised like they were celebrating victory. In others, they were shown with weapons that glowed with strange energy. But in all of them, the humans looked terrifying and unstoppable. "How is this possible?" Jake asked. "These aliens lived millions of years before humans even existed. How could they know what we look like?" Lisa shook her head. "I don't know, but there's more. Professor Amy Carter has been working on translating their writing. The things she's learning are keeping her awake at night." Jake followed Lisa to the archaeology lab where Professor Carter was bent over her computer. The older woman looked up when they entered, and Jake could see fear in her eyes. "Captain," Amy said, "I've translated enough of their language to understand the basic story. This race called themselves the Veltar. They were an empire that controlled dozens of galaxies. They had technology we can't even dream of. But something made them abandon all of this and flee." Amy pointed to symbols carved into a piece of stone on her desk. They called the thing they were running from the Devourers, according to their records. The Devourers were beings that never stopped hunting, never gave up, and never showed mercy to anyone who stood in their way. Jake felt cold as he looked at more pictures on Amy's computer. The Veltar had carved detailed images of the creatures they feared. Every single one looked like a human being. The Veltar described the Devourers as having a terrible power, Amy continued. "They say these beings could turn enemies into friends and make hatred become alliance. They write about watching their own people join with the Devourers willingly, abandoning their old ways to follow these strange creatures." Dr. Bennett pulled up more pictures on her tablet. "Captain, we found something else. There are Veltar ruins on 17 other dead worlds in this system. Every single planet tells the same story. The Veltar lived there for thousands of years, then suddenly packed up and left. And on every world, the last thing they built was a monument covered in warnings about the Devourers." Jake stared at the images. The monuments were huge towers of stone that reached up toward the sky. Each one was covered in carvings that showed humans as terrifying monsters. But what made Jake feel sick was how accurate the carvings were. The aliens had captured every detail of human anatomy perfectly, even though they had lived long before humans evolved. "There's something else," Amy said quietly. "I found references to something called the human curse. The Veltar wrote that the Devourers had a sickness of the mind that made them unable to accept defeat. They described watching these creatures learn from every battle, grow stronger from every loss, and refuse to stop no matter how hopeless things became." Jake walked to the window and looked out at space. Somewhere out there, ancient aliens had fled from creatures that looked exactly like his own species. They had run so far and so fast that they abandoned galaxy-spanning empires just to get away. "Captain," Lisa said, "we need to contact Earth Command immediately. This discovery changes everything. If there's even a small chance that these aliens knew something about humanity's future, we need to prepare for what might be coming." Jake nodded and walked to the communication station. As he started to record a message to Admiral Henry Brooks back on Earth, he wondered what kind of future the Veltar had seen. What had humans become in their vision that was so terrible it made an advanced alien race flee across the galaxy? The message he sent to Earth was simple but urgent. "Admiral Brooks, this is Captain Morrison aboard the New Horizon. We have made a discovery that threatens everything we believe about humanity's place in the universe. An ancient alien race carved detailed images of human beings into their monuments millions of years before humans evolved. They called us the Devourers, and they fled their entire civilization to escape us. We need immediate backup and the best. Xenobiologists Earth can send. Whatever these aliens saw in our future, it scared them enough to abandon everything they had built. We need to find out why."